culpable do you feel, Roger, the auditors and credit rating agencies are in failing to bring the perilous state of the bank's balance sheets to widespread attention? I mean, we've got the example of the Icelandic banks, which until a few days ago were being rated very highly, and yet in reality these banks were in desperate straits.
Yeah, I think the rating agencies are one of the major, not the sources of the problem, but they're one of the areas that has failed us, quite clearly failed us, and in a number of different ways and for different reasons. It seems to happen so often the rating agencies have actually got quite close to the people that they're supposed to be rating. Lots of evidence that banks have had discussions with rating agencies on the form, right, how have we got to do this deal, dress up this asset in order for us to pass your test? And they do all that, and of course then the rating agencies says everything's fine. But actually it's the wrong way of going about things. Well, I think there's been a vast failure of imagination and understanding and courage, which is not unusual in bull market conditions, but it's normal. I mean, I've been a great bearer of all this. I've been like a voice crying in the wilderness, or at least in the Daily Telegraph, which probably amounts to much the same thing, for many years. And I read a lot of books about the 1920s, and in particular Galbraith's book, The Great Crash, which was banned from airports a few years ago, by the way, is very elucidating on this. I mean, he says that what happens in a great bull market is that everyone slips their moorings. You're tempted to think it's a few silly investors who make some money out of something, blow the prices up to ridiculous proportions, while everyone else is standing around saying, oh, look at you. In fact, of course, that can't really happen, because if it were like that, the process could never get going, or at least would be stopped early on. What actually happens is the whole system gets taken in, including the regulators, the governments, the central banks, the auditors, the credit assessors, everyone. Everyone believes that they're onto, to quote the title of my last book, that they're onto money for nothing. And they want to believe it, and it's convenient to believe it. This government believed it. After all, they were the end of boom and bust, all that business, transformation. It was very convenient to believe it. It was quite convenient for all of us to believe it, wasn't it? Because while all that was going on, we seemed quite prosperous, house prices going up, all the rest of it. But in fact, all along, it was a collective delusion.
Well, that's certainly my impression, and you're the expert, Roger, not me, but to me it seems to come back to the basic principle which the banks forgot, which is don't lend money to people who can't afford to pay it back, because it's going to end in tears. And by wrapping it up in all of these very complex vehicles that nobody really understood, led to this sort of disaster. And looking at the case of the UK, which you illustrated with our house price boom, which was very much encouraged by the government, again you reach the point where, as I see it, how can you have a housing market that is sustainable if first-time buyers cannot afford to buy? Because ultimately the thing has to stop at some point.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, there were some extraordinary instruments and practices I think hardly anybody understood. I mean, I've worked in the markets for much of my life, and I know something about them, and about the traders, many of whom I admired greatly for their native wit. But I wouldn't have said detailed understanding of complex instruments or legal documents was actually their strong point, I mean, some of these characters who would otherwise be selling apples and oranges down the commercial road were actually selling all these complex financial instruments, because of course they never bothered to work out what they actually were all about. They just say, well, they're free for, gov, what you want to do. And that's the way the system worked. There's no surprise, I think. Meanwhile, of course, the boards of directors, having their smart lunches and picking up their nice titles and bonuses, hadn't got a clue either. It's quite extraordinary. But what I find odd about this is, although there were quite a lot of newfangled things, like all these CDOs, CMOs and all the rest of it, which brought great difficulty, if you look at the banks that actually went down, or some of them anyway, Northern Rock for instance, what actually brought them down was the most old-fangled thing of all. That's to say, liquidity. It wasn't some ultra-complex instrument. It was the fact that they'd borrowed short, lent long. They were completely dependent on money market funding, which when it dried up left them totally bust. So that's the bankers since time immemorial have known that.